Venice is the ultimate city, built out of artifice and ingenuity. It has been forged by all the energies of its citizens, an enchanted place that has created some of the finest art and music in the history of the world. It is still a place of dreams and visions, nourished by the water, a place of myth and of legend, sustained by love and pride. It may seem fragile, but Venice is strong, strong with the strength of human will and tenacity of purpose. It is a supreme achievement. It has been the model and inspiration for other cities in its ability to create and to sustain a civilized community. But it is, in fact, incomparable, a joyous place filled with harmonies of light and color, of water and of stone, of spirit and of substance. It haunts visitors and inhabitants alike with a passion. Is it any wonder, then, that Venice is the most visually seductive of all the cities of the world? Venetian historians claim that the city was established at midday on March the 25th, 421, by a poor fisherman known as Giovanni Bono, or John the Good. There are advantages to this theory, since the same date has been given to the vernal equinox, the Annunciation, and the supposed date of the foundation of Rome. The triple coincidence, as well as the provident arrival of John the Good, is too good to be true. But it is part of the extraordinary Venetian ability to supplant history with myth. Venice, in fact, emerged after a series of invasions by the Lombards in the late 560s and the early 570s. Their arrival prompted a mass exodus of the Veneti. Burano and Murano were extensively settled, as well as smaller islands such as Amiana and Constantiasa. These last two disappeared beneath the waves in the 13th century, swallowed up by the main enemy of the island people. They have never rested in their battle against the sea. Venice was born in this flight from the Lombards. They fenced the soil with planks and poles. They drained the water. They laid down building rubble, or sediment, or sand from the dunes. They erected wooden palisades to resist the sea. It is the beginning of the city known as La Serenissima. Everything in Venice is to be seen in relation to its watery form. The great houses and churches along the canals seem immobile, more solid than buildings ever appear on land. They are like cliffs along a shoreline, bulwarks against the watery element. The waters enter the life of the people. They are fluid. They seem to resist clarity and precision. In this most noble city of Venice, the architect Sebastiano Serlio wrote in 1537, it is the custom to build in a way which is very different from all the other cities of Italy. It is an insular architecture. It was architecture built on water. Of course, it will be different. The rhythmic intelligence of the Venetians has informed much of the architecture of the city. The oncoming sea changes the perception of structure along the Venetian canals, where the buildings seem more delicate and attenuated. The facades of the churches undulate, weightless and unstable, against the surface of the water like shells at the bottom of a rock pool on the seashore. The buildings of Venice reflect the spirit and nature of the city. They are its spirit and nature. They are the emanations or exhalations of the territory. That's why John Ruskin, the 19th century English art critic who lived here on a house on the Zattere, described his magnificent appraisal of Venice, the stones of Venice. The stones are its soul. Ruskin first visited Venice in 1835 at the age of 16. Between then and 1851, he came 6 times to study the architecture of this great city. He sketched architectural details, commissioned artists to record the facades of palazzos, and even arranged for casts to be made of carvings. For Ruskin became convinced that he was preserving, in words and pictures, a city in terminal decline. A ghost, he wrote, upon the sands of the sea, so weak, so quiet, so bereft of all but her loveliness, that we might well doubt, as we watched her faint reflection in the mirage of the lagoon, which was the city and which the shadow.
I would endeavour to trace the lines of this image before it be forever lost, and to record, as far as I may, the warning which seems to me to be uttered by every one of the fast-gaining waves that beat like passing bells against the stones of Venice. He felt that Venice was a very beautiful place, but he felt that Venice as a city was symptomatic of a decline. I suppose this sort of gradually formed in his mind after he had worked on the 7 Lamps of Architecture, that one of the themes of the Stones of Venice would be the rise and the fall of the city, and in a way it could be seen as a warning that he was delivering to contemporary industrial England. He arranged for scaffolds to be built, and he scrambled up the facades of buildings so that he could get right close up to a window, and he took measurements, detailed measurements. And the other thing that he would do would be to get plaster casts made of architectural details. There was nothing that he wouldn't stop at for his investigation.
Sarah Quill, the photographer and author, first came to Venice 40 years ago. Her work has been guided by the writings and observations of John Ruskin. She sees the city through his eyes.
This is precisely the sort of thing that Ruskin would have taken very detailed sketches and used in his notebooks, which were and all his preparatory work for the Stones of Venice. You've got the cable moulding round the door and the dental moulding and dogtooth, and then the Gothic coat of arms, which would be connected with the Moline family. In fact, this whole campo is flanked by two big Gothic palaces. It occurred to me that it might be of interest to people to see to what extent buildings had changed, or perhaps not changed, over the 150 years since Ruskin wrote The Stones. And there were his own drawings and watercolours to go from, and his descriptions.
Ruskin knew that Venice is a city of light. It cannot be captured in all its moods unless you are prepared to live there all the year round, unless you become one with the stones of Venice.
I prefer the rather more diffused light that you get in February or March, where the sun comes through the clouds, and it seems to me that it's rather flattering to the buildings, just in the way that shining a light through a gauze or a filter would be flattering in a portrait photograph. It's not enough just to photograph a building once, you have to photograph it many, many times, and I'm still at it even now. This Gothic one here, the Palazzo da Mula, is something that Ruskin would have approved of. He would have very much disliked the one next door, which has 19th century mosaics.
John Ruskin was among the most influential English authors of the 19th century. His work was widely read, and 150 years later, The Stones of Venice is still the perfect introduction to a city under threat.
I think his legacy is very great where Venice is concerned. Every architect in Venice would know about Ruskin, and certainly it's a name that's not been forgotten in this city.
The first dominant style of Venice can be loosely called Byzantine. It is a style of arcades and of domes, of round or inflected arches upon pillars, and of mosaics clothing the walls with beauty. The domed basilicas of Venice were based on an Eastern pattern, with the dome hovering over a cube of space in perfect alignment. It was deemed to be an image of infinity. Not much of Byzantium Venice survives. It was replaced by Venetian Gothic of the 13th and 14th centuries, when the eyes of Venice turned towards the west rather than the east. The Basilica of St. Mark is an example of Byzantine. The Ducal Palace is the embodiment of Gothic. The churches were now given vaulted naves, although they could not be built very high. The watery foundations of Venice could not sustain any great weight. There was a new interest in interplay of shapes and of materials, in the exfoliation of pillars and pilasters, in great portals, in trefoil arches, in quatrefoil tracery, and in double lancet windows. It was a style of pattern and ornamentation deeply congenial to the Venetian genius. Yet it was also a question of self-image by co-opting a Western imperial style and of a new form of magnificence.
Gothic created the city as a city in a way. In Venice you have an overlap between the two styles, the old one and the new one. So the Gothic arrives, you can have Gothic palaces up to 1480, 1490. And in 1499 is the opening of the clock tower, for instance. The clock tower is one of the early examples of Renaissance. There is an overlap of the two styles, which is very intriguing, very interesting.
So this mixture of styles is truly Venetian.
Very much. You know a cake, a multi-layered cake.
Yes.
So you have some Romanesque, the first layer is Romanesque or Byzantine. Then you have some Gothic style on top of it. And then the addition could be one floor of beautiful Renaissance style, and the top of it could be a 18th century Rococo style.
Yes.
The beauty of Venice is the complexity, is the richness. It's not the purity of style, which never existed in Venice.
There is in Venice an abiding attachment to the surface. It has become commonplace that in the city only the fronts of houses were deemed to be worth embellishment or decoration. Most of the Gothic facades are simply that, screens that bear no relation to the organic structure of the buildings themselves. It is one of the strangest aspects of a city that in certain respects resembles an ornamental shell. The rich plaster and stucco may conceal decaying brickwork, and Ruskin speculated on the duplicity of St. Mark's, where internal and external ornamentation were quite distinct. The city was built in brick, but disguised by marble. It seemed to matter not at all that behind the sumptuous facades, these grand Venetian houses were often cold, dirty, and uncomfortable. In similar fashion, among the owners of these houses, there was an outward show of prodigality combined with avarice and penny pinching at home. This was the Venetian way. It was not at all usual, for example, to invite guests into the house itself. That inner sanctum was reserved for relatives and for intimate friends. The 18th century poet Thomas Gray remarked that in their domestic lives, the Venetians were parsimonious to a degree of nastiness. Honour was important in Venetian society as in others, but the mark of honour was what was known as bella figura. It might be interpreted as the art of keeping up appearances. One of the great engines of Venetian life was, and is still, the fear of criticism. Everything must be done according to form and for the sake of form. That form may hide malfeasance and corruption, but it is important that it remains in place. It resembles the facade or screen of the Venetian house.
The idea of carnival, Venetian carnival, may help us a lot. You have a palace or a building which is outdated, a bit faded, not collapsing, but it needed some work. You are rich enough to change it. And the answer will be, let's change the facade. Let's put a new mask on the old face of the person. If you go along the Grand Canal, you have so many beautiful facades, but just look one palace, round the corner, the secondary facade, less important, is quite poor.
Yes.
What matters is the mask.
In the 16th and 17th centuries, Venice was touched by the